Chapter 9. Baker. I lay in my bed, Orion's bed, staring at the shadows in my room, unable to sleep. It wasn't the vampire, the feeling of her holding my skull in her hand, like the rest of my body didn't actually matter, or the ache from my injuries. No, that would be too rational. I couldn't sleep because I kept visualizing the perfect peach tart. Not only that, but some peach stuff pastry packed with cinnamon, lots of nutmeg, and a dash of something in Landry's chest of weird ingredients, second from the bottom right row. I tossed and turned for most of the night until finally, I threw back my blanket and got up, pulled on Sebastian's old sweats and a hoodie, feeling like old times before I hopped down the stairs on my good leg. When I put weight on the other one, the pain was much less than it should be, probably from me taking so much of Orion's energy. I'd seen what Landry did to his shirt, like Landry wanted to be sure I was tempted beyond what I could bear in the face of Orion's creamy, chiseled perfection. He really was the most beautiful creature in the world. I walked into the kitchen, flipped on the light and stared at the dark-haired creature I'd just been fantasizing about. He looked at me like he'd been waiting for me to come, like he had sent visions of pastries to dance in my head. I ignored him, going to the pantry for the basket of peaches that had been delivered a few days earlier. I began with the pastry dough, mixing in a good deal of the gray powder that smelled like squash slugs, and rolled out the dough, folding in a lot of butter. I couldn't help but notice that Orion looked tired and something else worried, maybe. How did tonight's hunt go? I asked, sitting on a bench to peel and slice peaches. He smiled at me, the most delicious smile a man could possibly have. Good. How do you feel? I shrugged. Good. I didn't say anything else for a long time, focusing on my work on slicing dough to the perfect width so I could weave the pastry around the peach filling that was simmering on the stove behind me. If he'd run away from me, why was he sitting here like old times watching me bake in the middle of the night? I put the first batch into the oven and turned to find Orion hovering behind me. I looked up at him while he frowned most seriously. I brushed his lips with my fingers, bits of sugary dough stuck on them. His eyes widened and I pulled away, leaving crystals of sugar on his lips. He took a deep breath while I sat down on the bench. I almost bit you earlier. I'm sorry. I stared at him, glanced down at the flash of teeth I could see through his parted lips. Like a vampire? He scowled. No, of course not. I don't want your blood. What do you want? I held very still as I waited for him to answer. Shouldn't have asked, probably. After you take my energy, I'm very hungry. For me? Like you want to eat me? He shook his head impatiently. No, for your pastries, cream puffs, sausage rolls, that kind of thing. I reached out tentatively, holding my good arm in front of his face. What do I taste like? You want me to taste you? I nodded. He raised an eyebrow before he leaned forward and took my wrist in his mouth. When his teeth pressed down, I gasped and almost fell off my stool. Fear was not even slightly part of my reaction. He pulled away and smiled at me. You taste very good, but not like food. I tried to get my breathing under control as I held my hands in front of me on my lap. Then why do you want to bite me? He smiled at me, leaning against the table with one narrow hip, his hand resting on the table only a few inches from my arm. I tell you that I want to bite you and you aren't running away. Maybe you don't understand. I might hurt you. That's why you ran away last night, because you thought you might hurt me? He nodded, serious. So after you bite me, then what? Would you think I was a pastry and keep munching in some sort of weird butcher thing no one told me about? He looked amused. No. I think the taste of your blood would be enough to break me out of my weird butcher thing if your screams didn't. So one bite and you'd come to your senses? Shall we test that theory? He scowled at me. No. I cocked my head at him. I've been bitten before. There was this mother cat that dropped a litter in the garage, then disappeared. We had to tame the feral kittens, and one of them, the black one we ended up keeping ironically enough, bit me almost down to the bone with its little razor teeth. I was so surprised I threw it across the room. Poor thing. He raised an eyebrow again and leaned closer. My wrist tingled where he'd tasted it. Poor thing. You probably couldn't throw me across the room. I stood up and lifted my chin. We should definitely fix that. Are you busy? Now. I have 25 minutes before the pastries are finished cooking. His lips tilted in a smile. You want me to teach you to throw me across the room? Or onto your back, something like that. He glanced around the kitchen. It's not really a room we're supposed to spar in. Landry would have my head. I patted his head, rubbing his hair in my fingers. He can't have it, I won't. Let him. He smiled slowly. I didn't want to tell you that I wanted to bite you, but it doesn't seem to discourage you in the least. I got up and winced when I put too much weight on my left foot. I'd forgotten that it was injured. You're top of the food chain. You couldn't be there if you didn't have teeth that went a little bit crazy from time to time. Was I really okay with the idea of Orion biting me? Would it be like the chunk taken out of Orion's arm by the scared werewolf? If you'd like to spar, we should go into the training room where they have mats. Lots of mats. He put a hand on my elbow before he pulled away. I took his hand in mine deliberately and squeezed tight. How bad of a bite are we talking? He raised his eyebrows. I have no intention of ever finding out. Would I turn into a butcher? Definitely not. We walked up the wide and shallow kitchen steps to the stone hall beyond. What about rabies? Are you up on all your shots? He sent me an amused glance. I should probably get a booster just in case. He nudged me gently enough that I didn't go over or anything. You're taking this very well. I sighed as we turned a corner and I saw the enormous gym filled with weights and ropes dangling from the ceiling while the center was clear. A stack of mats on the side. Thanks. I thought maybe you didn't like kissing me. His eyes widened in shock before he glanced down at my lips. Did you? I like it so much that I forget everything else. Even that I'm not a cream puff. He laughed, the warm low sound sending a shiver of happiness through me. I wouldn't say that. I get hungry, very hungry, and I crave more of you than I can humanly have. The next thing I know, I want to sink my teeth into you. When I take your energy? I asked, watching him get the mats from the side and arrange them on the floor. He stacked them 2 and 3 thick. When I kiss you? Landry is never tempted to bite my father, which I find unnatural. I'm tempted to bite my father often. What is the difference? He gestured me to come over onto the mat. Remind me where you're injured. I pointed at my neck, wrist, and calf. He nodded. The difference is that it isn't only the hunger. When I'm out fighting the darkness, the hunger grows in me sharper and stronger the more exhausted I am. I don't feel tired, only hungry. In that case, I'm hungry for the death of the monsters. It's euphoric in its way. You get high on killing things? He shrugged and put his hands on my shoulders, squaring me to face him. You're presenting a wide target. He tilted my shoulders so more of my side was to him. Smaller target. I suppose you could call it high, but it's like endorphins released after an ordinary human goes running. It's how I'm created. To keep me fighting faster and better the longer I fight, until I completely collapse, of course. Of course. He went around me, put his hands on my hips and said in a low voice beside my ear, your punch should come from the hip, the force from your legs through the floor. I shivered and struggled to focus on this technique stuff while he pulled my hand through the motion of a punch. So this butcher hunger is related to fighting nasty monsters, but it's also triggered when you're kissing me? That makes no sense. He laughed, a low growl in my ear, his hand warm on mine, his body brushing me, as if inviting me to fall back into him. None at all, except that the more I have of you, the more I crave, a bit like the fighting. An ordinary energy exchange shouldn't inspire those cravings, but desire is different. Hearing Orion whisper desire in my ear while he held one hip and one wrist, the one he kissed, the one that wasn't hurt anyway, sent a wave of awareness skittered along my skin, and I had a very difficult time breathing evenly. You don't think your desire will ever be satisfied unless you bite me? He laughed, low, warm, tightening his arms around me, sliding his hand over my stomach. Even through the thick hoodie it was earth-shattering. Biting you will not do anything like satisfy my desires. Because what you really want is cream puffs. He laughed low but didn't say anything, simply had me punch using my good arm. Over and over until he stepped back and watched me do it on my own. I tried to focus on punching through my hip, but it didn't seem to work without him helping me. I shook my head because I knew it was my subconscious just creating an excuse to have him close to me. You wanted to learn how to throw me, yes? I turned to face him on the blue mat. He crouched down, then moved into me, stepping to the side and pulling me against his shoulder before he flipped me. And I landed gently on my back, staring up at him. Are you okay? I sat up and nodded. Do it again. I have no idea what happened. I put my hip into your body, then twisted you over me. It's a good move for a smaller person. It's difficult to get people over me because I'm a little bit big. I poked his stomach, his rock-hard abdominals, then put my hands on my hips. Yeah? Are you calling me small? He smiled slow and sweet. You're not going to actually throw me today. That would put too much pressure on your leg. I just want you to practice the movements until you get them down. I nodded, and then he had his hands on my hips, ribs, arm, wrist, nudging my leg forward with his knee. Each contact like a burning coal that sent heat shimmering through me. I was moving with my eyes closed, Orion behind me, his body and mine working together when I smelled something. My eyes popped wide open and I ducked out of his arms to run limpingly towards the kitchen. Orion scooped me up and ran full out down the stone halls while I bounced in, his arms snickering. In the kitchen, he set me down carefully. Can I do anything to help? I smiled at him. Sit down. You're going to help me eat all these pastries. He grinned back. Such a difficult task, but I will do my best. I got everything out of the ovens, relieved to see that nothing was burnt past the point of consumption. The tarts I set to the side. They were for the CM. But I brought a very hot pastry to Orion on a pretty glass dish. Would you like to share it with me? My mother would do that, share the first one with my dad and then watch him eat the rest. Do you think you'll ever gain weight from eating all these pastries? My dad got a little bit soft in the middle. He raised his eyebrows. I would love to share a pastry with you. As long as I'm butchering, I won't get soft. Is it something you're looking forward to? Could work on it. I smiled and poked his stomach. My finger sank in a little bit as he intentionally kept his muscles relaxed. I think I'll take you however I can get you. I broke off a large piece of peach pastry and stuffed it in his mouth. I didn't feel any teeth, just tongue as he sucked on my fingers. He probably sucked longer than was absolutely necessary. When he put pastry in my mouth, I tasted his skin for a moment that I wanted to last longer. The pastry was gone after a few more mouthfuls and I felt satisfied. At least my baking compulsion was satisfied, but I needed more of him. I turned and grabbed a rack of pastries, set it before Orion and gestured. Eat these so that I can kiss you. He raised an eyebrow but obediently put an entire one in his mouth. Vanished almost immediately. Had he swallowed it whole? You're a little bit demanding. Eat this pastry, taste this wrist, it's shocking really. Is it? I suppose I shouldn't tell you to carry me up the stairs and tuck me into bed then. His eyes widened and he ate 3 more pastries before he answered. You definitely shouldn't. I'll get addicted to your demands and then I'll demand that you make them all the time. I smiled and leaned over to put my head on his shoulder. He froze for a moment before lightly covering my head with his hand. Orion, I'm very tired. As much as I want to kiss you, I think I'd better do it later. He stood lifting me up at the same time so my head could stay on his shoulder. I relaxed in his arms while he carried me through the kitchen, up the stairs, and to the bedroom that used to be his. He lowered me on the rumpled bed and stared down at me, his eyes dark and soft. I snuggled down into the blankets, rolled onto my side and smiled at him sweetly. Orion, don't you need to eat some pastries and then sleep at least for a few hours? Oh, don't eat the tarts. They're for the CM. I closed my eyes and felt the kiss he pressed to my forehead before he pulled the blanket over my shoulder, smoothed it down and then turned, shutting off the light and whispering sweet dreams before he closed the door. I woke up happy. Vampires might lurk and werewolves might shirk or whatever, but Orion made my baking compulsion seem normal, and he liked me so much that he wanted to bite me. I got dressed in my baking uniform, went down to the kitchen and hesitated on the threshold when I saw how many bakers were in Landry's kitchen. Violetta, Puffer, my uncle's baker, said, nodding at me from the table where he had his hands buried in an enormous pile of dough. The dough was chunky, with potatoes and other vegetables. Interesting. The other bakers worked on a variety of baked goods, but there didn't seem to be any order, and Landry himself sat in the wingback chair peeling an apple with his knife. He looked like a golden angel on his worn throne with an odd assortment of ministering angels hovering around, baking angels and all of them men most much older. Violetta, come, Landry ordered, gesturing to the stool beside him. I wove through the crowded kitchen to drop down beside Landry. This is different. He nodded and bit savagely into the apple. He chewed for a minute or two then smiled. We're here to discuss the baker attack. I blinked at him, then at the bakers, who seemed to be discussing what was the best ratio of salt to baking powder depending on humidity. Fun. What do you want me to do, other than clean up your mess when you've been baking in the middle of the night? He raised a golden eyebrow at me and I shifted uneasily. I'm so sorry. I completely forgot about it. I'd gone to spar with Orion instead of cleaning up. I wouldn't mind, except that the butcher took it upon himself to clean up, and he put everything away wrong. It took me 15 minutes to find the cinnamon. Why would he put it with the milk? Such barbarians, these butchers. I don't know how we bear it. The nearest baker, a bald man as short as he was stout, with blue tattoos circling his enormous arms, nodded soberly. Butchers don't belong in the kitchen. At least the CM knows his place. Landry hesitated, then nodded. True. The CM would never infringe in any of our kitchens. I studied the mass of white-aproned men and couldn't help but wonder if all bakers were so old. Landry seemed to be the youngest of all of them. How are you doing, miss? The same blue-tattooed baker asked, frowning in concern, his blue eyes like blueberries in his round face. HM? Oh, I'm fine. You were limpin', he said as he pointed a knife down towards my left leg. Should have taken energy from your butcher until you felt more the thing. Oughtn't she, Landry? Landry nodded, then hesitated. She's struggling with the connection. She should have drained that vampire faster than lightning. A bunch of bakers nodded their heads soberly and started talking at once. True that. She'll have to learn quickly. Didn't have access to many butchers when you were young, I take it. I smiled around and nodded, feeling weird. I'm trying. Of course you are, love. Landry patted my head like I were a kitten or something. I stood up and went to the pantry to get some eggs out of the refrigerator for breakfast, but Landry stopped me. Violetta, the bakers will have breakfast for you in a few minutes. Don't spoil your appetite. Seriously? I smiled at him and edged back in, but the bakers were a bit too much. Puffer came over to me, handed me a basket with a small knife in it. Why don't you go gather some leeks for me? You don't want to be around all these ugly bakers. Speak for yourself. An old man with a lopsided face and several missing teeth said before he threw back his head and howled with laughter. The rest of the bakers laughed, some less demonstrably than others, and Puffer shook his head tightly. He didn't approve of nonsense. He suited my Aunt Lottie perfectly. Did she ever feel the urge to bite Puffer? That was a shocking thought. I took the basket and hurried out the door, only stopping to pull a long coat over my uniform. It was later than I'd expected, but mist swirled up around the pool through the spots of warm sunshine that spilled over brown tile. The kitchen door opened up on a small patio with paths that led through the garden to the pool. Beyond the pool was a pool house, and then beyond that the woods and the path through them that led to the pond of purity. I walked through the garden, bending down to rub sage leaves in my fingers and inhale the scent while I stood in the quiet morning, soaking in the silence, even the cold that nipped my nose and ears, while the rest of me was toasty in the depths of the warm coat. Maybe it was Landry's. He'd handed it to me the first few times he'd sent me out to pick something from the garden. There was a massive vegetable garden on the far side of the pool house that still had a few cabbages, kale, as well as the rooted things, beets and turnips, carrots and potatoes. My mother's garden had always been mostly herbs. I wandered down the path, through the herbs and parterre that screened the pool. I'd have to go down to the vegetable patch for the leeks Puffer wanted. I smiled as I ducked beneath the outstretched arms of an apple tree. There were still a few apples on it up high. I hesitated. I probably shouldn't do anything silly with my injuries, but no one was watching me. I put down my basket and scrambled into the tree, laughing breathlessly as I pulled myself up and up higher until I could reach the apples near the top. The branch bowed beneath me, but it seemed sturdy enough. I picked apples and tucked them into my coat pockets before I sat and rode the tree like a boat through the waves of wind that gusted around me. I could see the tops of trees surrounding Candlestick and a few higher buildings in the distance. I ate an apple, crunching on it up there in the tree where Landry couldn't see me, telling me not to spoil my appetite like I was a little child. How strange. I drew back and hurled the core as far as I could towards the woods. Finally I climbed down, laughing as I swung down on the last branch. Apples? Can I have one? I gasped and turned towards Armand where he stood, watching me with those slightly creepy eyes of his. I shook my head and tossed him an apple. You scared me to death. Did you have nightmares of werewolves and vampires all night? He bit deeply into the apple. Nope, just pastries. I picked up the basket, put it over my arm like little Red Riding Hood and passed him to go towards the garden. He fell in beside me like I'd invited him. Did you find out anything from the phone? I glanced at him. Should I have? Your father lost all his money in the last year. Isn't that right? I shrugged. That's not really a polite topic of conversation. He snorted softly. Which is why it's so perfect for me. Don't you think it's strange that an accountant wouldn't have some sort of savings plan in place for his 2 children? Don't you wonder where all that money which should have been put aside for any emergencies went to? I studied him. Did you know a lot of accountants? He shrugged. I know butchers. We're a cautious lot in regard to our families. The CM probably checked your dad's accounts, but he might have missed something that someone close to him wouldn't. I came to a complete stop and turned to stare at Armand. What are you suggesting, Armand? He grinned at me, showing his teeth. Was he ever tempted to bite me? No, I didn't kiss him. Gross. I have some disreputable connections that might be able to get us inside your dad's old office building. And then, he shrugged. Won't know until we get there. My heart started pounding and I nodded. Okay, we'll do it tomorrow. No, I have a date tomorrow. How about Thursday? He frowned at me. You're ready for another one after the last disaster? I stared at him. Who told you about that? He grinned back. Toothpicks. That kind of thing spreads fast. I winced. Oh, apparently it wasn't a good idea. He shook his head. No, it wasn't. Thursday will work. The Greek can come with. We'll get pizza afterwards. I bit my lip. Okay, our date is to go get haircuts at the Greek's. He raised his eyebrows. Orion letting the Greek get close to him with a razor? Interesting. Such a brave butcher. You seem far too happy today. You didn't drain the butcher to the dregs or you wouldn't still be limping. I shrugged and tried to walk without a limp. It was barely noticeable today. I'm not very good at that. It took me ages to take anything from the CM. He's supposed to be really easy. How am I supposed to suck the life out of vampires in one touch if I can't even do that? Practice. Most bakers grow up in a butcher's house with plenty of butchers. They know well. Familiarity is part of connection. There are kids in butcher houses? How strange. I can't really see it. Oh, those weapons. Why are all the bakers so old? He raised his eyebrow and gestured towards the house. Landry's having a bakers' war council. I nodded. Only experienced bakers are invited. In the last few decades the CM has made our district very friendly to bakers. They're not as well respected in some other places. That's attracted the best bakers in the country, and, subsequently the oldest. Bakers get better with age like wine. And cheese. And stew. I wrinkled my nose. What kind of stew do you have? Kimchi, yes. Stew, no. He laughed and ruffled my hair. I grabbed his wrist and closed my eyes for a moment, concentrating on him. His energy was so different, the push and pull of different levels, the butcher strength beneath the sporadic energy that was like trying to catch firecrackers in my mouth. I focused on him, putting my other hand to his cheek to drain him. I pulled his energy into me, drop by drop, but it wasn't easy, and when I finally blinked and pulled away, he eyed me weirdly. How did that go? You're not a very good butcher. He laughed, a warm low growl that was wild and unstable but still made me smile. I am a very bad butcher, he corrected, heading away from me. Saunter in his step. 10 in the morning by the Pond of Purity on Thursday. Wear your fluffiest sweater. I shook my head at him before I headed back into the kitchen. Leaks completely forgotten. Chapter 10. Butcher. The world was beautiful. Autumn all golden and fiery, bare trees strong. Sentinels as I drove down from Candlestick, top down, wind rustling through my hair. She should have a stronger sense of self-preservation. Once I got to Calder, school for boys, Sebastian fell in beside me as soon as I entered the hall from the garage. Did you sleep at all last night? You need your rest. I glanced over at him. There are different kinds of rest. Your sister seems to be suffering no lasting trauma from the incident. He shrugged and stuffed his face with a roll. Of course not. She's tough. Like our mom was tough, you know? Are you sure you want to date her? I stopped and turned to look at him. I want to date her even more than I want to eat her pastry. He winced. She made you pastry? What kind? Was it good? She used to make me muffins all the time, but sometimes she'd do these cream puffs. He grinned at me. All right, if you like her that much, you must be serious. He frowned. Suddenly. How serious are you? Violetta hasn't dated guys. Went to that all-girls school, and then dressed as a boy. She's not really ready for anything serious. I patted his shoulder and gave him a tight smile. You sound almost like a brother to her. If she isn't ready for something, I trust she will tell me. He scowled, sudden and fierce. He reminded me of the old Tansetta I'd hated so much. I'm her only family. If I thought you would hurt her, I would never let you be with her. I held very still while I studied him until he shifted uneasily, but he maintained his position. I sighed and patted his shoulder. Down, Sebastian. You know perfectly well that the only thing I wish is her happiness. I am serious about her, though. I don't know how to be anything other than serious. He frowned for a moment, then nodded. Violetta's like that. Too serious. Sometimes. She used to laugh more before I got sick, before our parents died. Maybe you could help her lighten up. I'd like that. I turned and kept walking, nodding at Francis, who took that as an invitation to fall in beside me. How's the baker? Good. How did the CM kill the vampire? She'll be sentenced soon. He shook his head. Man, you must hate that. Do you want to go out tonight and slaughter some vampires? I heard rumors about something going on in an abandoned ale factory. I smiled at him. That sounds positively pleasant. It was. Francis ended up falling in thrall and wooing the young vampire lord, while Sebastian almost fell over laughing, and I had to capture the monster. Didn't kill him because there were no signs of prisoners or murders, but I had a good chat with him while Sebastian sat on Francis, keeping him from helping the vampire lord escape, calling him Poodle Dumpling and Heart's Beat. Called him Vampire Lord because he had a white cravat and a black top hat. I held him suspended in a ball of holy water, his head sticking out so I could talk to him. I grabbed a splintered chair and sat down on it, leaning over to study him, not his eyes naturally. Tell me about yourself. I am Horace VonTruffle. How dare you treat me this way? Don't you know who I am? What I meant by tell me about yourself is how long have you been in this area? What are your plans? How do you feed? And how often the parts one care about? He stared at me haughtily for a few minutes while I waited. Young vampires were not terribly patient. It's none of your business. I'm the butcher. This is precisely my business. What wouldn't be my business would be decapitating you without talking first. That would be my pleasure. He sniffed his pale nose, the skin around his mouth faintly stained and flecked with dried blood. It was old though. I've heard about you. Your brother the werewolf, but you still act as though you're above it all. On the contrary, nothing is too low for me to slaughter like the butcher I am. Sebastian, do you think I should cut off his arms? He grunted, struggling with Francis. His nice coat wouldn't hang quite right. I'd cut off his sleeves as well, naturally. What kind of a monster do you take me for? I threw a knife. It cut through the bubble of water deeply into the joint of his left shoulder. The vampire squeaked, eyes widening. What do you want to know? What brings you to our fair city? The vampire glared at me, but I wouldn't meet his eyes, so he eventually settled for looking moodily at his shoulder and the blade in his rotting flesh. I heard that interesting things were happening, the dawning of a new age, an age where the creatures of the night didn't have to hide or slink through the shadows any longer. By all means, come out of the shadows and into the sun. It would make my job much easier if you all went up in flames. He grimaced. Are you going to remove the knife? Tell me how such whisperings came to your ears, Lord VonTruffle. He must have been mad to choose such a name for his new post-death existence. Sebastian snickered. The vampire tried to look arrogant, but floating in a ball of water, even with a top hat perched on his head, he lacked a certain elegance. I was in a gaming den of the sorts you probably aren't familiar with, and my opponent told of a night of darkness in this city that hasn't happened in 100 years. He said that the werewolves are uniting against butchers, that it's only a matter of time when the vampires and werewolves put their differences aside and unite against our common enemy. I stared at him. He just executed himself. Francis got his hand around Sebastian's throat. I walked over and punched Francis, knocking him out cold and bruising my knuckles before I turned back to the vampire. Let me be clear. You came here to persuade the werewolves and vampires of your acquaintance to go to war against butchers. His lip curled. Such foolish lips. I came here to see if such rumors were true. And what, my lord, did you discover? He hesitated, and for a moment his eyes, which I could see in my periphery, gleamed red. There are those, he began, but the rest of his words were drowned out by the sound of shattering glass. I glanced at Sebastian, who sprinkled Francis with holy water before he whirled around to fight the vampires who flowed through the glass, faces terrifying. The thing was, a vampire had hurt my Violetta. I'd been desperately wanting to hurt vampires. For me, this attack was a gift. I only hoped that Sebastian wouldn't get in my way, and that Francis would remain unharmed. I smiled as I drew my weapons and beheaded my first adversary. I whirled around, punching back a white throat, then inserting a stake into one's heart, whirling away and then back around to yank off a creature's head. Sebastian worked well, and even though vampires continued flowing through the windows at us, we kept them at bay with every flick of the blade, every stake to the heart, every head that rolled. I heard wolves baying, and for a moment my mouth watered at the idea of more opponents, but then a vampire got ripped backwards from the window he was struggling to enter. Armand. His wolves would not be allying with vampires any time soon, particularly not stupid ones. After the attack, I stood in that square box of a factory, in the middle of bodies at various states of decomposition, and stared at the chin of the vampire who still floated in the orb of holy water. His skin was coming off in chunks in the liquid, dissolving his unholy and impure flesh. And now it is time for my pleasure, I murmured, staking him through the heart, withdrawing my knife and stepping back as the ball broke, sweeping around the bodies with a sizzle. The fool vampire slumped on the floor, top hat still somehow on his head. What? Francis sat up, gasping, looking around wildly. I walked over and pulled him up, damp and disoriented. You looked at a vampire. Honestly, Francis, you could just tell me that you don't wish to be the next butcher. He stared at me, eyes wide, then looked over at the permanently dead vampire in the top hat. That's embarrassing. You fought us like the devil, Sebastian said, struggling to keep his face straight while he cleaned his knives on the clothing of one vampire who was in fairly good shape for a corpse. Right, I agreed. I had to knock you unconscious, you were so vicious. I exchanged a glance with Sebastian, who gave me the slightest flicker of a smile that reminded me of Violetta before he focused on the matter at hand, that is, retrieving all his weapons and cleaning them before properly installing them back on his person. It was a very good hunt, and even Armand's growl at me before dashing into the shadows didn't diminish the glow of contentment I felt. I went directly back to Calder to look through all the reports, stacks and stacks of reports that I'd let get out of hand. I sighed as I sank into the red velvet couch and only stopped to text Violetta that I wouldn't be able to meet her in the garden that morning, but I would pick her up at 3:30. Reports of vampire movement in North City weren't terribly noticeable, but if I'd been paying attention, I wouldn't have been surprised by VonTruffle's friends. Not that it wasn't a pleasant surprise, but Armand was right. Couldn't allow myself to get careless because I was wrapped around Violetta. Was the butcher. At the same time, I clearly needed some help getting to the bottom of this stack of reports. I skipped classes, taking my meals in the black box, because not only did I have to read reports but make assignments of the butcher routes and duties. I sketched out the north side, idly trying to get a feel for the movements of darkness that crept down. The renegade undercover hadn't sent a new message for days. Maybe it was time to track him down and pull him in for his safety. I frowned at my horribly drawn map and smiled when Francis came in with a basket of baked goods. For you. Landry sent them over. I may have eaten one. Just kidding. He grinned widely at my snarl. You've been doing that all day. You need it. Secretary. Not that I'm volunteering. So Sebastian's pretty impressive. I nodded but didn't say anything because I had 6 peach tartlets in my mouth. Apparently Landry hadn't thought that the CM needed all of those. He's going to be the next butcher, isn't he? I nodded, swallowed, and said, probably. It'll be interesting to see how he deals with the butchers who feel betrayed by him and the renegades. That gives me an idea. I bent down and organized a group of older butchers with Tansetta to attack the renegades. It would make it clear that Tansetta was on our side against them, not just against the darkness, and also give us the chance to see whether or not my plant had either gotten turned to their side or caged. I had to run to make it in time to pick up Violetta, stopping my car with a jerk at the front of Candlestick when I saw her standing outside the front doors swinging her backpack. She skipped towards me with a slightly shy, slightly mischievous smile on her lovely face. Orion, don't get out. She swung her bag into the back seat and vaulted over the edge, making her skirt flip up a little bit on her legs. She sat down, smoothed down her skirt, and turned to take my hand in hers. Can I hold your hand? Always. I focused on driving instead of staring at her, into her soft green eyes and even softer pink lips. How short do you think I should go? She tugged on the ends of my hair so gently I barely noticed, but I swung my head towards her anyway. She was so lovely, so sweet. Are you really excited about cutting your hair? Or can we do something else? Her hand gripped mine tight, and I saw the frown between her eyebrows before I once more focused on the winding drive before me. Something else sounds even better. Where shall we go? Shopping. I stopped at the corner and looked at her for a moment. Shopping? What kind of shopping? The best knife shops are to the right, the best armored coats are to the left. She gave me a pointed look. I want to buy a fluffy sweater. Doesn't seem like you're ever going to give back my old one. I wouldn't need it if I had her in my bed. Come to think of it, the last few nights I hadn't spent doing much sleeping with or without her sweater. Knowing that she was sleeping in my old bed made it so difficult for me to be anywhere else. Clothes shopping, so the mall? I think I've been there once. She snickered. You've been to the mall once? Oh, this is probably going to be torture for you, but if you're very good, I'll buy you a pretzel. Left? Driver. It wasn't exactly torture, but having to constantly watch everyone around her, when there were so many possible threats, none of which I could kill, made me nervous. She finally set me down in a comfortable leather chair and came out of the dressing room to show me a bewildering variety of pink and green sweaters. Which one makes me look the most adorable? She asked, turning this and that way in a figure-hugging pale pink sweater that looked as soft and touchable as her hair. I adored her in every single one. I cleared my throat. You should get all of them. She laughed and came over to perch on my knee like a butterfly or something. Beautiful and alive, too easily crushable. Orion, you have to promise me something. I stared at her as she leaned closer, her sweater brushing my long coat. Do I? All right. You can't steal any more of my sweaters. Promise. She held out her hand, soft dusky skin waiting for me to take her. I slid my palm against hers, the contact sending a wave of contentment through me. You ask me to do such difficult things, but I'll try. Think you should get this one. I like it very much. I couldn't help but slide my hand up her side over the soft fibers, not as soft as her skin, but what was. You like it, but is it adorable? She bent close to me, and for a moment I thought she was going to kiss me, but then she slid away from me, out of my hands, to turn around so I could see the sweater, and more interestingly, her, from all angles. I think it's a little more sexy than adorable, I admitted. Her pale green eyes widened and she glanced down at the sweater. Really? When she looked back up, she was smiling. Orion, you think that I'm sexy? I fought back my own smile. Did I say that? No, I believe what I said was that the sweater was sexy. It had nothing to do with the person wearing it. She looked a little crestfallen, and I laughed and pulled her down to sit back on my knee. I kissed her nose. Do you know what is the most sexy thing in the entire world? Your brother's hoodie and sweatpants. Those lying in my bed were the most deliciously tempting things I've ever seen, and I've seen your cream puffs. She pushed away from me and stared at me, thoughtful. I see. You don't want to talk about it. Desire, right? Do you think you'll bite me? Her lips were so close I couldn't help but lean closer and closer until I could practically taste the strawberry flavor of her lip gloss, but she pulled away at the last second, smoothed the sweater down, and walked back to the dressing room, sending one come-hither glance in my direction before she disappeared from sight. I sighed deeply and ran a hand through my hair. Olivia sat down beside me, stretching back and crossing her legs, her black jeans and leather jacket butcher ready. You aren't answering your phone. No, I'm not. You think it's that important that you sit outside her dressing room without Any distractions?
He smiled at her politely.
Clearly. Make your point. She pouted. You work Sebastian too hard. That wasn't what I expected. Do I? Good. He needs to make up for lost time. She added a beseeching look beneath her dark eyelashes. He never has time to go out with me. It's always training, homework, butchering, or running some stupid errands you have him on. Not that your errands are stupid, but he has no free time. I see. How was I supposed to tell her that Sebastian wanted to be busy, that he made up his own errands and acted without my direction half the time? He'd struggled to become a butcher's boy his whole life. Even a woman like Olivia would find the competition fierce for his attention. Olivia, you know that. These days of darkness are hard on all of us. I personally haven't slept for 3 days. In the spring things will be easier. But you're still here with her. You make time to be with her. She sounded genuinely worried. I sighed. This was not what the butcher was supposed to do. I'll ask Violetta if she'd like to go on a double date with you and her brother if you'd like. You know that my job is not fixing your love life. She smirked as she stood. No, not now that it's no longer our love at stake. Thanks, Orion. Tell Violetta hi for me. I'm really looking forward to our date. She turned and disappeared quickly, leaving me with only a few minutes before Violetta came out carrying 2 sweaters. When she went to buy them, her card was declined. She was mortified, but when I slipped the cashier my own card, she put up a very strong fight. So strong, in fact, that she stopped talking to me when I bought the sweaters anyway, and wouldn't look at me while I followed her through the mall outside, through the parking lot to my car. I put the bag in the back seat while she frowned out the windshield. You can pay me back if you want. Violetta? I didn't mean to upset you. She turned to me, her eyes bright with unfallen tears. I'm not upset. I mean, I am, but not with you. Why didn't my dad leave a fund for my brother and me? I've never had a card rejected before. You're rich, so it's probably nothing to you, but try taking all of that away and see how it feels. She shook her head. I'm sorry. I should have just made you return my old sweater. My mother gave it to me. Memories are worth more than money, right? But I haven't got very much left of them at all. I think the Vanettis have a box of their stuff somewhere. I should go through it. I put a hand on her knee for a second, but it wasn't quite friendly enough, or rather too friendly. I pulled away and tapped the steering wheel. I should sleep before tonight's hunting. I should, but I wouldn't, not if Violetta was upset. We can go to Calder and get it right now. I'm sorry. It was selfish and stalkerish of me to keep it. There is a fund for you and your brother through the butchers. If you ask Landry or the CM, they'll get you set up with cards and passcodes. I'm so sorry. She punched my shoulder, a good punch from her hip. It made me smile. She threw herself into my arms, sniffling. Don't apologize for your stalker tendencies. It's one of my favorite things about you besides everything. Yet, let's go to Calder. I need you to make me some chocolate and just be with me. Is that okay? She pulled away to look at me with her pale green eyes. Yes, very okay. I put the car into gear and drove quickly down the streets, onto the highway, and exited near Calder. I passed cars like they were standing still. I shouldn't speed, but I needed to give her chocolate and hold her. I parked outside the high metal fence and held back the bushes for her to pass through. I unlocked the gate and opened it soundlessly for her. She raised an eyebrow as if impressed, and I smiled at her, putting my hand on the base of her back to help her through. It had nothing to do with me wanting to touch her. It was around 6 when most of the boys were at dinner. Convenient. I draped my coat around her shoulders and walked through the hall as though I owned it, her following me in a slouch while she scowled at the world in her version of her brother. When we finally got to my room, I pulled her in, closed the door, and went to heat water on my hot plate. Do you think anyone noticed that you took a girl to your room? I forgot how everyone stares at you like you're their superstar. I glanced at her from the cupboard where I pulled out my chocolate canister. I don't really care. You don't worry about getting expelled by the headmaster and have to find a different prissy rich boys' school to attend. I gave her a stern frown. Firstly, no one is going to kick me out of anything. Secondly, it's not the prissy richness of this school that appeals to me. It's the armory and the training ground out back. Show me a school with that, and I'll consider transferring. I dumped the chocolate into her cup, put a different kind into mine, one without the potency of baker chocolate, and came over to where she stood still wearing my enormous coat. She didn't look remotely masculine. Adorable. She lifted her chin. I'm not wearing a sweater. I kissed her because surely that's why she'd lifted her lips up like that. Kissed her again, slow, gentle brushes that sent a shock of exhilaration through me along with hunger for more. I slid the coat off her shoulders and wrapped my hands around her waist. I studied her for a long time while she rested her hands on my chest. What are you doing? Her voice was a breathy whisper. I kissed her again. I'm cataloging your features. Eyes green too. I kissed her eyebrows. Lips pink too, I said, kissing her lips. One nose. One chin, I kissed each. And one mouth. I bent to kiss her but she pulled back. You already did my lips. Yes, but not your mouth. She stared at me. Are you being silly? You are. You're usually so terribly serious. She kissed me, pulling my head down, sliding her hands through my hair while she tugged me closer, her lips warm against mine, soft and supple, parting as she pressed into me deeper until I drowned. When someone knocked on the door, she pulled away, leaving me breathless, her own chest rising and falling and her lips more deliciously pink than ever. Wanted to ignore the idiot who otherwise would die, but I heard Sebastian's voice. Hey, Orion. He pounded on the door with his fist. Landry's in the kitchen. Wants to talk to you. Landry. Of course. I shouldn't be kissing Violetta without supervision. Bottle of pills and someone to stop me in case things got out of hand. Even if she didn't mind being bitten, that's because she never had been. It would hurt her. I could never hurt her, not for any reason. I stepped away from her and spun around to yank open the door. Pulled Sebastian in by his collar, closed the door behind me and headed down the hall. Before I changed my mind, I ignored everyone I saw so that I didn't do something regrettable. When I reached the kitchen, I went in the door that showed signs of new welding as they used metal to reinforce the panels the freshly turned werewolves had broken through. Orion, taste this, Landry said, holding out a spoon of creamy custard for me. I opened my mouth and tasted the strangest combination of flavors. Vanilla, warred with oregano, and above that dill danced with cinnamon. Vile. He nodded but watched me intently. My heart rate slowed, the anger faded, and I felt much less hungry as well as instinctual. I'll work on the flavor later. Right now it's about efficacy. I'd happily feed you horse feces if it protected Violetta. I nodded. I'd happily eat them. You won't, will you? He grinned, his pale eyes laughing at me. I'd always thought he looked like a cat, a tawny cat that would purr one moment and dig its claws into you the next. You're giving her your chocolate? I nodded. Good. Are you going to keep her here for the night? I stopped breathing for a moment. Was he giving me his permission? He grabbed my shirt front and yanked me close to him. A minute earlier that would have been something I could not ignore. Be very cautious, Oren. Don't let your physical desires interfere with your mental faculties. Violetta is still wondering if she wants this life, this world. You must prove to her that it's worth having, that her place here is completely accepted and natural. Sneaking her into your room at Calder is going to give her a different impression. I hesitated, then nodded. My phone buzzed and I answered it. Tansetta. Sebastian, is everything okay? Oh, you mean Vi? Yeah, no vampire or werewolves have attacked her. The water's boiling. Which mug is hers? I ran a hand through my hair. I'll be there in 2 minutes. You're going to take her back to Candlestick. You're going to walk with her through the halls. Like she's your sister and she belongs here. Got it? Sure. I won't mention that it's a boys' school and that my sister isn't exactly the same as a boy. I hung up and turned to leave, but Landry stopped me. He held out a little bottle with a dropper. 3 drops in your drink once every time you feel hungry for more than muffins. I took it and studied him. Thank you, Landry. I'm sorry I made you come here. He shrugged. She'll be the greatest baker in her time if we don't scare her away. And that's our only motivation. His smile was melancholy. There's always more than one reason. I hurried back to my room, breaking through Andy and Toby, who were plotting some mischief I didn't have time for before I broke through the doors and took Violetta in my arms at once. I kissed her hard, fast before pulling away, little bit dizzy but mostly determined. I needed balance. I needed to prove that she could be part of my life without wrecking it and causing her own subsequent problems. I would be good for her. She deserved so much. Chapter 11. Baker. It was 10:15 when Armand pulled up in the Greek's little white hatchback. I smoothed down my pale green sweater, the one that smelled like Orion, and climbed in. The Greek was expecting to see you yesterday. Good morning to you too. I smiled at him and handed him a bag full of muffins. We went to the mall to find a sweater. He glanced down with a puzzled look on his face. He bent over and sniffed my front like that wasn't weird, then pulled away with a lopsided smile on his face. How did you get that away from the butcher? Never mind. I probably be shocked. I sighed and settled down in the seat while he took his time eating 5 muffins at once. You probably would. I stole it. He raised an eyebrow, the expression a lot like Orion. Did you? Don't you like him to have something of yours? After all, you have his bed and his wall of weapons. I laughed. Yes, his wall of weapons is very cuddly. I think I'm going to order a mattress pad. Maybe I'll go the whole way and get a down mattress. You butchers and your hard beds. He grinned at me, showing his teeth and a bit of muffin crumb before he started the car. Not us butchers, Vanilla. I personally have a very soft bed. I laughed. That explains it. You're too soft to be a butcher. He only looked amused. He drove the car slowly. I expected something else. Fast like Orion or paranoid like the Greek, but he drove like a responsible citizen like my dad probably. Where do you live? I asked for something to say. Between the Greeks and the werewolf station you visited. So in an apartment building? It's a house. Really? You sound surprised, Vanilla. You thought I really lived in a shed and are now disappointed that I not only have a bed, but a house. Is it one of those enormous mansions that are all broken down and boarded up? No, surprisingly enough, it is not. Jack keeps it up to date? He gave me a surprised glance. Ah no, you should probably forget about Jack. He's a werewolf, you know. I nodded. So you live between the werewolves and the city like a bastion against darkness, parked right there in the middle of danger instead of like candlestick. He snorted. No, I live away from the butchers because they're a bunch of holier-than-thou mindless morons who think with their knives. Sure, they do a necessary task, but dealing with them is certainly one of the least pleasant things I do. Why? He glanced at me. Why what? Why did you quit? Did you do something even worse than get a soft bed? His mouth twisted into a cruel smile as he murmured, Don't ask so many questions, kitten. You also probably shouldn't feed me. I pulled the bag of muffins away from him, took one out and ate it while he glowered at me. You did follow me home, didn't you? Are you a stray? Is that how you feel? Not part of the butchers, not part of anything else. He laughed loud and wild when I'd expected more snarling. I laughed along with him because it was such a bright and sunny thing. That must be it. When he pulled into the parking garage across the street from my dad's old office building, my heart lurched. I really didn't want to go in and see his office without him in it. On the other hand, if there was something to find, then I would. I unfastened my seatbelt and got out as soon as Armand put the car in park. I headed out, aware of Armand 2 steps behind me. I turned around. Wait here, or at least give me a 20-second head start. I have an idea. I went up to the desk and smiled at Sally Pershawn, who had worked there as long as I could remember. Violetta, look at you. I haven't seen you since. She trailed off, and her features took on a tinge of sorrow that made my own eyes well up. None of that. I took a deep breath. Hi, Sally. I'm still trying to get everything organized. After the accident, I wonder if you know what happened to my dad's office. Things. There were some photos on his computer as well as hanging that I thought I should get. She nodded, her short blonde hair bobbing along with her. Of course. Everything is in the basement. I'll have Ralph escort you down. I nodded and glanced behind me to see Armand slouching in, looking a bit disreputable. I brought my friend to help me carry stuff. I waved him over. He looked like one of those 30-year-olds who still lived at his mom's house. Maybe I should have said he was my cousin. I smiled at him brightly. Hey, they have all the stuff in the basement. Sally is going to call Ralph. Oh, Sally, this is my friend Armand. I patted his shoulder awkwardly before turning back to Sally. Sally was giving him a suspicious frown. Are you sure your parents would approve of him? Isn't he a little too old for you? No offense, Armand, I'm sure you're a nice boy, but maybe a little too old for our sweet Violetta. Armand stared at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. I tried to object, to say that we weren't like that, but he only nodded soberly. Thank you, ma'am. I'm sure that I don't deserve her. Smile straining, she cleared her throat. Well, Violetta, it was lovely seeing you. Here's Ralph. I turned and stared at the Greek who came towards us in a security uniform. Gave Armand a questioning glance, but he only put his hand on the small of my back, murmuring, Come along, Vanilla. Mustn't keep Ralph waiting. I waited until we were in the elevator before I turned to push Armand away. But he already had his arms crossed, staring straight at the doors like he was bored. I turned to glance at the Greek, but he only shook his head slightly, and glanced up in the corner where the video camera was. Right. You should have told her that you aren't my boyfriend. Essish, the Greek murmured, nudging me. I like your hair, he whispered. I smiled at him. I was going to stop and get a trim, but I needed to get a fluffy sweater. He nodded like that made sense. I didn't really see what difference a fluffy sweater made, but whatever. When we reached the basement, it looked exactly like the rest of the building, wide corridors with gray carpeting, high quality fluorescent lighting, inspirational quotes, that kind of thing. The Greek went to the door and unlocked it before glancing casually up and down. The hall led to a room full of computers covered with drop cloths. The Greek closed and locked the door behind us, then moved to the nearest computer, a much newer laptop like my dad's. They were all the same though. Generic business models. So how is everything going? The Greek asked, not looking up from the computer, his hands flying over the keys. Are you a hacker? I asked, perching on the table beside him. He smiled slightly, but didn't take his eyes off the screen. I speak the language of computers, yes. They like to whisper their little secrets to me. He glanced at Armand. Not that I'd ever do anything illegal with my talents. I'm completely reformed. Armand snorted. Violetta, how are things between you and the butcher? He gave you back your sweater. Does that mean you broke up? I glanced down. How did you know that he had it? The Greek shrugged his enormous shoulders. Armand told me about it. How did he know about it? That's a good question. Armand shrugged. I know butchers. The Greek waved one hand. Back to the interesting bit, are the two of you together? Or did you have a fabulous breakup? What were you wearing? I sighed. I stole it while he was distracted. I didn't think that it was a big deal. The Greek and Armand exchanged glances. What? I demanded. Armand drawled. He's going to think he'll have to keep something else in his bed at night. I rolled my eyes, shifting. We aren't like that. Why not? He's gorgeous, all that hair and those eyes and the way he looks at you know that he wants to gobble you right up. I bit my bottom lip, and then the thought of Orion biting me made me press my lips together instead. Greek, you have an unhealthy obsession with my relationship with Orion. We're still working on the basics, like how to date without a vampire attacking, or what we like to do together. The Greek gave me a look, and Armand sighed. Greek, she's right. You're unhealthily obsessed with the butcher. He shrugged. He's hard, Violetta's fluffy. It's a fascinating combination to me. My sweater is fluffy. I'm not. I'm actually a very serious person. My whole life I've been an overachiever. The fact that somehow I've come to sitting in basements with hackers talking about my love life is not a sign of my identity. I'm very serious. The Greek put a hand on my shoulder. So soft. No, Violetta, it's not that you aren't serious, it's that you're his match. The idea of the butcher with another butcher is completely dull, but you and the butcher is brilliant. Star-crossed, a contradiction that can't help but spark. I frowned at him. What do you mean star-crossed? We're kind of a no-brainer. I'm a baker who needs his energy, he's a butcher who needs my bread. As completely rational for us to be together. As butcher and baker, but not as lovers. I shook off the embarrassment. Not that we are lovers, but why not? The Greek glanced at Armand, who stayed silent. I don't know much about butcher business, but it seems like butchers and bakers don't ordinarily date. Am I wrong, Armand? Armand shrugged. I knew a male baker who married a butcher. They were revolting to watch. He had bite marks all over from her. He didn't seem to mind. To be honest, most butchers aren't all that interested in anything other than slaughtering. That's where they get the rush, the hunger. For Orion, you're a distraction. He should be focusing all his energies and efforts on fixing the world, but instead he's trying to keep you happy. Being a good butcher is all about balance, finding that balance of energy, intent, Strength, justice, mercy, and there you are tipping everything. No single life is supposed to be worth more than any other to the butcher. I stared at him. That was the most he'd ever said about butchers before. Do you think that I'm bad for him? Not that I'd listened to him. He was clearly demented. He smiled slightly.
No.
I think you're the best thing he could possibly have found. You can give what he does purpose and meaning. He's changed in only a few months. He's developing empathy, compassion, connection, and I believe that came from you. I frowned at him. I don't understand. If I'm bad for his balance, how can I be good for him? The Greek answered for him, turning to pat my shoulder again. Armand is saying that the butcher is evolving into something else. Maybe he's becoming more human. But if it's making him a worse butcher. The Greek waved his hand and directed my attention to the screen. Why was your father draining all your accounts? This was last January. These are very impressive sums. I frowned at the numbers because I knew those accounts. Those were my and Sebastian's savings accounts, the ones that had very little money in them but a year ago had over 100,000 in each. I stared at the Greek before turning back at the screen. Where did it go? He brought up another screen. These various companies, but they're all linked to the same number. It's a beautiful umbrella. If I were going to set up a plethora of fake accounts, this is exactly how I'd do it. He glanced quickly at Armand. Not that I ever would scam someone out of their life's income. What's the fun of that? He glanced at me and smiled hugely. This will be practically impossible to trace. The fluffy sweater came into play when I was leaving the building with a computer. I carried the company computer under the pictures in the cardboard box right past the security guard who was staring at Armand like he was taking off with company property. I didn't like it, but the Greek assured me we were only borrowing it. Armand added that he would make sure it was returned. On the drive back, I sat beside Armand, the computer propped up at my feet. I can't let you take it, I finally said. He glanced at me. Oh, where do you want to eat? I stared at him. Eat. It's after lunch. I need to eat before I take you back. Here's good. He pulled into an empty slot, his parallel parking perfect in every way. He got out without asking me if I wanted to eat. He didn't really look at me, just walked down a few steps to enter a Cuban-style restaurant. Had I come here with my parents before? I couldn't remember. I looked around at the plants lining the tiled floor and hanging from the windows. It was a world away from the busy city street outside. Took me a second to realize that Armand was at the bar, and by the time I got over to him, he'd already ordered for both of us. I stared at him while I sat there. He got up and moved 2 seats to his left. Away from me. Okay. I propped the computer at my feet and ignored him with the same focus he gave ignoring me. What was his problem anyway? He was definitely on the spectrum and probably also schizophrenic or something. On the other hand, the sandwich he ordered me was amazing. I'd almost forgiven him for being so weird by the time I'd finished it. When I looked over at him, the remains of 4 of the enormous Cuban sandwiches littered the table in front of him. He turned to me with a satisfied smile. Shall we? I shrugged and got up, noticing the bills he dropped on the bar. Is that the tip for having to deal with you? He shrugged. This is me being pleasant. Perish the thought. Armand, where's the Greek? I'd like to hang out with him. Not that you aren't charming company, but you want to talk about your boyfriend some more. You bring out an interesting side of him. He should be back in his shop. We can go there. Now that you've eaten and aren't so hangry. He looked over at me. Hangry? K12. Like hungry and angry at the same time? My dad would get like that. Not like you're completely unbalanced, no offense, but like a butcher, I guess. I've never noticed Orion getting cross when he's hungry. The butcher bit you yet? I glared at him. No. Not that it's any of your business. He smiled at me sharply. No, it's not. It's just that whatever the butcher does affects the whole world. For instance, after the vampire incident, he decided that he needed to rush into a vampire nest without much backup to speak of, also that he could slaughter the vampires without having to share them with any other butchers. I shivered in spite of my sweater. How many vampires did he fight? Slaughter. There were too many decomposing bodies mixing with holy water to really tell for certain. It's a good thing. This year the north side is full of dark things. Better to cut them down before they overrun you. I nodded and got into the little car. He got in and turned on the heater. Maybe I was just shivering from not wearing a coat. I need a coat. And jeans. And I don't have any money. He froze before turning to me, a look of horror on his face. Do you want me to take you shopping? I laughed. His terror was palpable. I patted his head. No, absolutely not. What I need to do is sit down with the CM and talk about my finances. You know the fact that I don't have any. I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to be making something from this internship, and Orion said something about a butcher's fund, but I don't really want to talk to the CM. He exhaled, visibly relieved he didn't have to take me shopping. Couldn't imagine him ever agreeing to something that bizarre. Maybe he thought he'd have to for my protection, so what happened to my parents didn't happen to me. Did he feel responsible for my safety in some way even though he wasn't a butcher? He was around Candlestick a lot for someone who wasn't a butcher. The CM will take care of things. You should have talked with him already. He owes you. He'd give you anything since you saved the butcher. As for money, you should make Orion buy you things. He'd enjoy it and you'd get to train him right. He'd particularly enjoy buying you bed dressings. Bed dressings? Who says that? No, I really disliked Orion paying for my sweaters. I'm going to return them, even if he said one of them was sexy. Bit my lip at the memory. Don't do that. It'll make him cranky. He won't take it out on you but on the darkness. Never mind, make him as irritable as you like. The darkness could use an angry butcher. That was one way to look at it. I guess I could pay him back once I get things sorted with the CM. Or you could take whatever he gives you and express a very nice thank you butcher as payment. You could even kiss him. Money won't do him nearly as much good as you staring up at him like he's your moon. Okay. How do you stare at the moon? He laughed. The moon is my lover, constant and changeable in the same breath. The moon is my heart, my soul. I do not look at Orion like that. He snorted. No, of course not. Let him buy you things. Better yet, make him buy you things. Be dominating. He'd really enjoy that. While you're at it, bite him. That would be hilarious. I sighed. Armand, it's a good thing you don't have a girlfriend. The moon is my lover. He began singing. The moon is my mistress and only true love. His voice was surprisingly good, and the lyrics, while clearly spontaneously made up, weren't as awful as they could have been. I watched and listened to him for the rest of the drive until we got to Candlestick. Landry was waiting by the Pond of Purity when we pulled up. Armand got out with me to walk over. Nice car, Landry said, voice clipped, and the look he gave me not happy. I wasn't sure why he was upset. I told him that Armand was taking me to meet with my friends. He was, though. He frowned as though I'd gone to visit a vampire. Armand grinned at him. Isn't it a beauty? Don't snarl, Landry. She's all in one piece. You worry too much. She's going to get the impression that you don't trust me. You had lunch? Landry asked Armand. Armand nodded. It was a good thing. Vanilla said I was getting hangry. She doesn't like me when I'm hangry. I stared at Armand, the way he loomed over Landry, but grinned like a madman. Did you get drunk on the way back when I wasn't looking? You're positively loopy. Armand turned his eyes on me. Such strange eyes. I should return to my soft bed, round like the moon. Good night, Vanilla. Happy baking. He turned and loped off, not back down the drive, but into the woods around the pond. I stared after him for a minute, then turned to Landry with a shrug. I can definitely see why he didn't work out as a butcher. Still, I am safe with him, aren't I? Landry hesitated. Safe is a relative term. He'll most likely protect you from anything else that means you harm. How do you feel when you're with him? I laughed, amused, confused, and glad that I don't see him any more than I already do. At the same time, I think he'll protect me if he has to. You don't worry that he'll hurt you? No. I think he's my friend. At the very least, we both want to find my parents' killer. That counts for a lot. Landry sighed and put his arm around my shoulder. There wasn't any exchange of energy, not even the little bit I felt whenever I brushed against Armand. Yes, Armand dislikes guilt and responsibility. He'll rest easier once this business is behind us. He dropped his arm before it got weird. Landry, do you think that I unbalance Orion? He hesitated. You could say that. You could also say that you inspire him to greatness. He's been a butcher for a long time, and the butcher at such an early age. Some are born great, some become great, and some have greatness thrust upon them. You could say that he's experienced all three. He needs someone to care for him, someone he lets take care of him, keep him out of trouble, make certain he gets what he needs in healthy ways. What does he need? He smiled at me. He needs to love and be loved. He needs to be reminded of the beauty, the goodness, the light in this world. And of course he needs your baking. Has a butcher ever bitten you? He raised his eyebrows. No. I've never kissed a butcher. Oh, okay. That wasn't the kind of thing I should ask the guy I was interning with. Awkward. On the other hand, he was a baker. But my mother, do you think a butcher ever bit her? I mean, maybe that's why she quit. Maybe. Violetta, you need to be careful with Armand. He's not stable. I know. I've taken his energy. He's like firecrackers. He froze, his golden eyebrows drawing together dangerously. You took his energy. When? How? You can barely connect with a CM. How can you connect with Armand? I shrugged, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. I guess my first time was a few weeks ago. He found my parents' bodies and we were talking about it. He feels guilty about it for some reason. He shouldn't though. He's not the monster. Who did that? He hesitated before he shook his head. No, Armand isn't. Did anyone tell you about Lance? Who? Olivia's brother, right? He died. Wait. In this world, what were the odds he'd actually died in a boating accident? How did he really die? We never found his body, but Armand fought him before that. He's the last one who saw him alive, so. I frowned at Landry. Lance was going against Orion, right? Landry raised an eyebrow. We don't know that. It was pretty clear that he thought he should be the butcher instead of Orion, but openly fighting him? That's serious. Was this Lance somehow involved in my parents' deaths? Why? How? It made no sense. So because Lance thought he should have been the butcher instead of Orion, that's why Olivia blames him for Lance's death. Orion defended Armand, refused to believe that he killed Lance without any proof. I studied Landry while I tried to work out details in my head. Orion was the butcher instead of Lance. Orion's the butcher instead of a butcher? What's the difference? The butcher is responsible for all the other butchers in his district only under the CM. Ah. I nodded, although I still didn't understand. We walked back to the house, the cold air making my skin prickle under my sweater. I really needed a good coat, a cute good coat. What kind of coat girl would Orion like? Leather. Jacket like Olivia? A classy trench girl? Maybe a long wool coat with a lot of buttons, soft and warm. How big is a district? I asked as we reached the pool. There wasn't any water in it. When had they emptied it? The CM's district is a little over 550 miles. Some are larger, some smaller. Oh, wait, Orion is in charge of all the butchers in that area. No. His district is closer to 100 miles radius from Candlestick. It's not the distance that matters but the number of butchers. And he has. Landry shrugged. I don't know. 2,000. I stared at him. 2,000 butchers? Active. More in reserve. Even more in retirement. Oh, so many, and Orion was in charge of them? He hadn't mentioned that. He had lit the biggest candle, and there had been all those butchers. He'd stood beside the CM, I thought, because he was the son. He'd said he'd killed the most monsters. That had to be a lot. Like more than a lot. Do you know how many vampires Orion killed the other night? He raised an eyebrow. Does it matter? I shrugged. I'm trying to get a grasp on this. Between 50 and 60. It's difficult to tell when holy water is involved, as well as the usual decomposition. I stared at him. Orion killed 50 to 60 vampires like the vampire that attacked me. He shook his head. No, the vampire who attacked you was ancient. These were all fairly newly dead. The oldest was probably in its 70s after death. He didn't kill them all. Your brother Sebastian did a good deal of damage. I stared at him. Sebastian, my brother? That's it? Orion just decided to go charge that many vampires without any help? Is he completely insane? He smiled slightly. He's the butcher. I threw up my hands and stalked ahead of him into the kitchen. You say that like it means something. It does. He wouldn't have that position if he weren't worthy of it. The Sam hasn't made a mistake in who he calls, not once. That's comforting. So when does Orion retire? Landry shook his head. That depends on him. Merlot's still going strong. Of course he doesn't have a district, but still a solid butcher. I rubbed my forehead before I started grabbing ingredients. I needed to make something rich, something decadent, something with chocolate pudding layers of it. Chocolate cake, molten chocolate cake with layers of chocolate, grated chocolate studding the top with perfect chocolate whipped cream frosting. Baked without talking to Landry, and he stayed out of my way, filleting something that used to be cute and fluffy. By the time the cake came out of the oven, cooling on a rack while I whipped the cream frosting over ice cubes, Orion came in, standing in the doorway at the top of the broad steps that led into the rest of the house. Butcher, I said coolly. Baker, he returned, a smile on his mouth, but it wasn't quite as sweet as usual. He walked down the steps, slow and decisive, like he wanted to take his time getting to me. The Greek found the companies that our money was funneled into. He raised an eyebrow. How's the Greek? I frowned at him. Fine, I guess. I don't know. We didn't really get a chance to talk. Ask me how Armand is. I've had way too much of that idiot. Don't you think that's interesting? It might lead us to my parents' killer. He nodded and slid into the bench across from me, staring at the enormous cake's cooling. Very interesting. Why didn't you tell me about it? I shrugged but felt a flicker of guilt. I'd never lied to him, but I could have mentioned why I needed my fluffy sweater, which I'd gotten flour all over. I frowned down at it. I'd have to wash it, but then it wouldn't smell like Orion. My dad was paying someone something that looks like blackmail. What would you do? Never mind. Your dad's the CM, so he wouldn't ever make a mistake, right? You were protecting your father's reputation. I understand that. Trusting Armand, though. It was his idea. He grinned at me. Ah, and you can't resist larceny. I chewed on my bottom lip to keep from smiling back at him, but I couldn't help softening. Orion, are you being careful? He blinked at me. Careful with you? Yes. Not me. Everyone talks about how many vampires you killed the other night, without waiting for help. Oh. He frowned like he was perplexed. It wasn't that many. 50 to 60 vampires isn't a lot? He smiled slightly. That many? Interesting. I should read the report. You were there. Why do you need to read the report? He shrugged and covered my hand that held the silver mixing bowl. It's your baking. I can't fail while you are my baker. That's idiotic. He laughed and leaned over to bump my forehead with his. I'd call it more providential than idiotic, but that's me. Faith can seem foolish to those who haven't tasted your baking. Orion, doesn't it bother you to kill that many people? He stared at me, pulling back. No, they aren't people. But that vampire talked to me. What happened to her? He inhaled deeply. Nothing. She's awaiting her sentence. Landry and the bakers will decide her fate. But you don't like that? Then why did you take her to trial if you wanted to kill her? He studied me for a long time. I'm the butcher. I serve justice. If I didn't, I'd be a monster like all the monsters I destroy. Let's hope I never go quite that far. He stood up. Are you still willing to see me tomorrow for our knife-throwing date? I sighed. Don't you have to go through reports? You're in charge of so many butchers, it doesn't seem like you have time for dates. Did you sleep last night? He gazed at me with those warm chocolate eyes, sweeter than anything else. How could I sleep without your sweater? I rolled my eyes and put down the bowl where the mixture was finally thickening. I unbuttoned my sweater and held it out to him. He didn't take it for a long time. What? Don't you want it? I don't have anything to give you in return. I nodded at his black shirt. Take it off. Your sweater is worth more than this shirt. Then give me your pants too. His dark eyebrows rose before he smiled slyly. Violetta, you can have absolutely anything of mine at any time you choose, however Landry might not like me walking around his kitchen completely naked. I cocked my head. Don't tell me you aren't wearing anything under your pants. I gasped after I'd said that because oh my, that wasn't any of my business. He laughed, warm and delicious like chocolate, beautiful rich chocolate that I needed to drown in. I immediately put a spoonful of whipped cream frosting in my mouth. But not good enough. I needed Orion He leaned over and wiped my lip with his thumb, put the bit of chocolate in his mouth, his pink tongue licking his fingers like a cat, the big kind that could rip you apart. I grabbed his face and kissed him, the taste of chocolate. What I'd been craving since the last time I touched him, kissed him. I kissed him until I was dizzy and buzzing. When I pulled back, he smiled at me, all soft and sleepy. I must have taken a lot of his energy, and he probably hadn't slept the night before. I went to get a pink tablet for him before turning back to the cake with renewed focus. His energy wasn't unbalanced. Whatever Armand and Landry said, Orion was perfectly solid. But he needed sleep. I'll throw knives with you if you promise to get some sleep tonight and finish your reports and wait for help before going after a bunch of vampires. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind while I focused on the icing, the layers between the two cakes, pockets of molten chocolate inside the rich chocolate deliciousness. I didn't need cake when Orion had his arms around me. I smiled as I finished the frosting, taking my time because I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to do with everything so bright and lovely it couldn't be real. That's a very extensive list. Anything else? He bent his head and brushed his lips along the side of my neck. I shivered and gouged the cake with my knife. I bit my bottom lip trying to focus. I think I would like you to buy me a coat, wool with lots of buttons but not tough. I licked my lips and tasted chocolate. And I want you to give me lots of money so I don't have to talk to the CM. All right. Do you want me to set up an account for you, or do you prefer cash? I elbowed him. He grunted but didn't move. You're supposed to object. Really? Oh, I object. What am I objecting to? I'd hate to be imprecise. You think that I should be independent of you, not rely on you in case this whole thing between us crashes and burns. The whole thing meaning the you being my baker or you being my kissing companion. That doesn't seem to encapsulate my affection for your sweater. I snickered. I'm trying to be serious. So am I, but I think we're trying to be serious about different things. He sighed, his breath skittering across my shoulders and making me shiver. Are you cold? Do you need your sweater back so soon? I need you, but I can't have you wrapped around me all the time, can I? Of course you could. All I need to do is grow my hair a little bit longer. Maybe a yard or two, and then I can wrap it around you while you bake, and I can sit and go through stacks and stacks and stacks of reports. You should bake something to make my hair grow faster. I sank back into him, the cake finished and absolutely beautiful, but not nearly as beautiful as him. Would you like to share a slice of cake? Before you demand that I eat it all? Yes, I would. I would like that almost as much as precisely what I'm doing right now. He kissed my jaw, his lips soft and warm, the contact sending a buzzing over my skin. Okay then. I licked my lips, but I wanted to turn around in his arms and kiss him. Why shouldn't I? I couldn't move because his hands, while gentle, wouldn't let go of my waist. I'm trying to kiss you, I said, struggling to turn. I don't think that's a good idea, he murmured low and soft in my ear. Why not? Because I'm very hungry and you taste like chocolate frosting. I cut a piece of cake, arranged it on a plate and held the fork out over my shoulder. His mouth covered the fork. Then I turned my head, catching him in a kiss that spilled through me like rivers of delicious chocolate that satisfied cravings I'd never known I had. It wasn't a long kiss, not at the awkward angle over my shoulder, but it was still sweet. So very sweet.